Hi, welcome to the Basic FBA to BSP training. We're going to start with Module 1, which focuses on defining and understanding behavior. Before we begin, I want to thank you for taking the time to complete the demographics questionnaire and also for taking the pretest. So in Module 1, the following objectives are the things that we're going to focus on. We're going to go through the features of defining observable behavior. We're going to focus on identifying the events that predict the when and where that the behavior is occurring in, identifying why a student engages in specific behavior, and then putting all those pieces together to construct a full hypothesis statement that lays out what's the behavior, when and where is it happening, and why is the student engaging in that behavior. So as we start thinking about understanding students' challenging behavior, problem behavior can be very confusing and frustrating, and so we've got just a little cartoon here to take a look at. And so I wouldn't say your son is a bad child, he's gifted at disruptive behavior. I think as educators and maybe as parents, we oftentimes find ourselves quite perplexed at what is going on with a child's behavior. And the intention of this training module is to be able to kind of organize and think about behavior in a way that makes it more manageable and more understandable for us. And throughout this training, we'll be applying a research-based framework based on decades and decades of behavioral research. We're trying to really simplify that and make it understandable and usable within a school framework for helping to manage students' problem behavior. So we're going to start with the ABCs of understanding behavior. A is the antecedent, and we're going to again try to really break that down and look at what that means. And so the antecedent are really the events that occur almost immediately before the problem behavior. We refer to them often as the trigger, and oftentimes this is going to be really exploring the when and the where of the problem behavior. So we're trying to find some of the predictable features of the triggers and the things that are likely to happen before the problem behavior. The B is, of course, the behavior, and in most cases here we're focusing on students' problem behavior, but we also may be thinking about what are the behaviors that we would like to see the student engage in instead of the problem behavior. Either way, we're going to really focus on what is the behavior, what's the behavior that we don't want to see, what's the behavior that we do want to see, and in this module we're going to focus on how to present that in an observable way, a measurable way, so that we can make sure that we're talking about the same behavior and try to be able to measure whether or not we're making progress with that. And finally, we'll look at the consequences or the outcome of the behavior, and this is again from the lens of the student. So what's from the student's perspective, why are they engaged in the behavior? What's the function of the behavior for them, the purpose that the behavior is serving? And so as students are engaging in behavior, there's usually an immediate response following that behavior or in pretty close proximity that's meaningful to the student. And so as we're trying to understand what is the behavior, and we're really kind of an investigator in this situation, trying to understand why is this important to the student, how come this behavior is meaningful, what are they getting from that behavior. And so this is the ABCs of behavior, antecedent, behavior, consequence, and that's going to guide us in understanding students' challenging behavior. So we always start, and so we've kind of laid out the ABCs here in a little visual with these boxes, and we always start by defining the problem behavior. And so remember, the behavior is what is the student doing, and so in this case we're usually focused on what's the problem behavior that they're engaging in, but we want to be really clear about what that behavior looks like, because too often if we're not clear about what that behavior is, it becomes really hard to make sure that we're focusing our intervention appropriately. So we'll begin by looking at and defining the problem behavior. So it's important that we, as I mentioned, define the behavior in observable terms. And so a lot of times we will use terms to talk about behavior that aren't very clear and aren't very specific. And so we're really going to focus on how can we make this behavior observable and measurable? How can we count it? or in some cases we may be timing the behavior if duration is important, if the length of a tantrum might be important. But we want to start out by really making sure that we can see and really understand and decipher when a student is engaging in a behavior and when they're not. We want to define the behavior so clearly that if I gave two people the definition and they went into a classroom to observe a student, that they'd be able to recognize that behavior without a doubt, and they'd have pretty high consistency in terms of when they understand the behavior is occurring and when they understand the behavior is not occurring. So here's some examples of some more observable and measurable definitions and some less observable definitions. And so oftentimes we hear people throw out kind of more non-observable definitions, like a student has attention problems. Well, attention problems can look like a lot of different things across a lot of different students. And so we want to get more specific and more observable than that. And so attention problems, as you look on the left column here, we can break that down into tapping your fingers, drumming on the desk, looking around the classroom. Now that's a lot more specific and a lot more observable than this much broader category of attention problems. And so we really want to be focusing in on can we observe clearly what this looks like, so that we can differentiate between students whether they have what we might understand as attention problems, which is too broad, into the more observable and measurable definitions. Similarly, you can see here, looking at the non-observable, the second example here, non-compliance. Again, non-compliance can look like a lot of things across a lot of different students. And we start talking about, this particular student, Billy, with Billy, what is refusal to do work? How does he refuse to do work? How does he fail to follow directions? And so we might even get a little bit more specific than this example here by saying when he refuses to do work, he says no, he throws his paper on the floor, he tears it up, he walks away from his desk. We want to get really specific and real observable and measurable in what the particular student is likely to do when they're engaging in the problem behavior. So we got a little activity for you here, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up on the screen an example of a definition of behavior, and I want you to just kind of to yourself say, is this observable? Yes, or no, it's not observable. And so I'm going to just pause for a second and let you come to your judgment, and then we'll give you our response. So the first one. Student gets out of their desk and hits another student. Is that observable and measurable? Yes or no? So we would say yes, that is pretty measurable and observable. You can see specifically if a student is in or out of their desk, and of course we could define this a little bit more specifically and get really clear and really specific, but we can generally see if a student is getting out of their desk and hitting another student or striking another student. All right, next one. Student has separation anxiety from their parent. Is that observable and measurable? We would say that is not real observable and measurable. Separation anxiety is a pretty broad term and a broad construct which kids can display separation anxiety in a number of different ways, and so we would want to see that defined a lot more specifically than it currently is. Okay, so the next one. Spacey. So we would say no, that is not observable and measurable enough, because your spacey may look different than my spacey. And so we again want to get really specific. Well, the students looking out the window with that glazed over look in their eyes, and they're not paying attention to instruction, whether it's from the student or the teacher, or whether it's working on a worksheet. And so we want to get really specific about what is spacey. So that we can be more clear and be consistent in measuring whether or not it's occurring. All right, the next one. Reads 120 words per minute. So we would say that is pretty observable and measurable. So we can specifically measure and listen to the students reading and document the number of words that they're reading per minute. So we would classify that as observable and measurable. Okay, the next one. Says she hears voices. So what do you think? Yes or no? We say yes. This one's a little bit tricky, right? We couldn't tell if she actually does hear voices, but we can actually observe and measure whether she says she hears voices. So, student says she hears voices, we can document that. But if it was just hears voices, of course, we wouldn't be able to tell in an observable and measurable way whether or not that's actually occurring. But we can document whether she says she's hearing voices. All right, the next one, emotionally disturbed. So you're probably starting to get a little quicker at this. We would say no, that is not observable and measurable. Again, my emotionally disturbed may be different than your emotionally disturbed and how I express that. And so we'd want to get really specific about what my emotionally disturbed behavior looks like, whether I'm, hitting, kicking, spitting, what those specific behaviors might be. All right, and doesn't like classmates. So we would say no, that is not observable and measurable. We want to get a lot more specific about what it looks like when a student is engaging in behaviors that demonstrate that they don't like their classmates. Maybe it's calling them names, maybe it's specifically saying I don't like you, maybe it's ignoring them when they're speaking to you. Again, we want to get much more specific to have a good, clear, observable and measurable definition. So as we're defining behavior, the first tip we have is always ask yourself, what does the behavior look like? And so it's good to start out with a definition. And so in this case, you can see talking out has been defined as any verbalization made by the student that was not initiated by the teacher and or distracts other from the assigned tasks in the classroom. And so this is a definition that starts to get pretty specific about how to define when talking out is occurring and in a way that we can actually observe and measure that. But that oftentimes that still isn't specific enough, and we like to be able to kind of define the boundaries using more specific examples and non-examples. And so examples and non-examples can really help us to clarify the differences, especially when it does get into some of those gray areas of what is and what is not an example of the behavior. And so talking out here, you can see, there's a lot of times when students are going to talk in class, and sometimes that's very appropriate and other times it's not as appropriate. So examples of talking out would be answering a question that was directed to another student by the teacher, or talking while the teacher is giving directions. So you can see how those are very clear examples of talking out, which is problematic, or talking to peers during independent work time. Very clear examples of talking out. Now the non-examples, we also want kids to know what is acceptable and what are not examples of talking out, so you can kind of define that boundary, and of course for our teachers and observers who might be looking at the behavior. But non-examples of talking out would be, when is it appropriate to talk? So answering a question the teacher is directed to that specific student. During recess, yelling to another student, that is an acceptable time to talk out and maybe even to yell. Of course we'd like to see appropriate comments and such, but and then finally talking with a peer during group work time would not be an example of talking out. So we want to be clear about defining what is appropriate behavior and what is not appropriate behavior. So if we put together that definition and provide some examples and non-examples of problem behavior, it really helps us to clarify what is the specific behavior that we're looking for. This also becomes important when we think about teaching the student what's the behavior that we want to see. So here we put them all together. We start with that initial definition. We lay out those examples and non-examples, and hopefully if we provide this much information, usually we're at a pretty solid place, especially if we do have a good range of examples and non-examples, for people to have a pretty strong understanding of what the problem behavior is and when it's occurring or when it's not occurring. So our first activity is, you can look in your participant guide as another guide, but we've also, if you look below on the screen here, the next activity below the video that you'll be seeing, there's an option for you to define any one of these behaviors which currently are not observable and measurable enough. So we're just asking you to choose one of these and provide a clearer definition of maybe what is disruptive in class for Jeff. And so you see the block next to that. You can just fill out your more specific definition, and after you do that, we'll have kind of you self-check your definition and see how it matches up with some of the definitions we've provided as examples. So we're going to give you a couple minutes to do that, and when you're done, you can hit the green arrow under the box to move forward, and then we will go on to the next part of the training.